Welcome back, usual suspects, to Hidden Catastrophe Science, Episode 2. In Part 1 of this groundbreaking series, we looked at a classified CIA brief involving the work of a man named Chan Thomas. We promised to reveal the full entirety of this man's work via video files and potentially PDFs and or audiobooks in the future, because we feel that it is important to get this information out to our community. We also were thinking about a certain ethical dilemma that might be involved as going through the Hidden Catastrophe Science series. We are planning on having an ethical discussion amongst a roundtable of individuals to discuss how this information should be shared responsibly and whether or not we need to consider how other individuals, especially young people, might be affected by this information. Before we reveal the rest of Episode 2, I'd like to begin with Gary, who is on the call, as well as the rest of our team, to have a discussion about the material presented in this Episode 2. And I'd like to start with Gary involving what might be a potential moral dilemma with sharing this information.
Well, I think it's a moral dilemma, and this occurred to me over a period of time. It kind of grew upon me. It's a moral dilemma because we are, in fact, giving a demonstration about the processes and methods and techniques of ending the world. And the fact that we have, in the past, come within a razor's edge of an extinction level event, at least on one occasion. And the evidence is very strong that we're facing another one in the near term.
And Tony, I know you had some thoughts about this disclaimer about an ethical dilemma. Would you like to share those?
You need to think about who you're going to share this with. As we know, sharing information can sometimes be challenging, but this type of information is extraordinarily challenging, both in how it affects people and whether they're ready to even accept what you have to share.
Great points. So now with that disclaimer out of the way, and with the knowledge that in a few episodes later we'll be doing an ethical roundtable about how to handle this information, I invite all of you usual suspects to sit back, grab your popcorn, and see the rest of the Chan Thomas story as we go through a multi-episodic series and reveal the entirety of Chan Thomas's work, including who he is, why he's important, and his connections to the rest of the conspiratorial world. In the first section of Episode 2, I'd like to quickly discuss the availability of Chan Thomas's book, Adam and Eve Story, as well as the availability of the Postlude follow-up. There are numerous digital archives, even on archive.org, that claim to be the full text of the Chan Thomas, the Adam and Eve story. When you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that this is actually just a copy and paste of the CIA briefing that was released. Additionally, when you go to places like Amazon, you'll find instances of the Adam and Eve story that claim that they are out of print, limited availability, but that there are one used copy, for example, for $589. We ran into an issue when we were exploring this, that what was being claimed to be the full Chan Thomas Adam and Eve story was actually just printed and bounded copies of the CIA briefing report. Gary, did you experience that as well?
Yes, I did, and along with other examples of that in the past, people will take just basically copies of a book, Xerox copies as they used to be called, and bind them and sell them as a legitimate copy. So be careful about that.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, quite frankly, this will no longer be an issue for all of you because we will be delivering the entire full copied text of the original Chan Thomas story and the postlude on this channel, so stay tuned. If you are interested in collector's items, you'll be able to cross-examine them with the material found on this channel. I'd now like to move into the World Cat. This is a catalog of available library books across the world, and you will find 5 instances of the Adam and Eve story, and this one at the top called Adam and Eve Story, The History of Cataclysms. After going through each of these 5 links, they are identical in availability across the world's libraries. You'll see here there's 1 through 6, as well as about 4 pages of other libraries which claim to have this book. However, we clicked through all of these links, and the vast majority of them, save for one, that we were actually able to find the full copied text, the vast majority of them are either out of stock, lent but never returned, missing, or go to 404 error pages. So that was kind of a frustrating moment for us on the team. Before I get back to the WorldCat, we also noticed going throughout the internet this Google Books page, which seems to indicate that the actual book is 232 pages long. This, as far as we can tell after an exhaustive investigation, is not true. There is no edition of the book that is 232 pages long. This likely was a typo mistake error that has now perpetuated itself across the internet. And Gary, you were telling me a little bit about how you exhaustively went through the available world catalog of interlending library books, and none of them had a document that was 232 pages long. Could you expand upon that a little bit?
That's absolutely correct. And the fact is, down on that page where you see ISBN, that's an international subject something number, I can't remember exactly. If you search on that number in the WorldCat, that will give you the same results as the book search itself. And none of those are 232 pages. That is a unique number to a unique book. So if there were another version with 232 pages, that number would be different. The ISBN would be a different number, and it is not. So somehow or the other, it got out there that there were 232 pages. If someone can produce a 232 page book, I more than encourage them to do so.
I would agree as well. After an exhaustive search, it appears that this 232 page book is not real, was a typo that somebody put into Google Books, and has now perpetuated itself around the internet world as being the full copy of the book. As we mentioned, we have the full copy of the book, and it is not 232 pages, and more on this a little bit later. When you travel to this page called goodreads.com, you can see that this also includes 232 pages. And I wanted to explain to you how this could happen. The way this happens is through a process called Google scraping. If Google Books erroneously identifies that the full version of this book is 232 pages, then other sites will automatically, through the usage of Google spiders, capture that information and create subpages of their own book repositories to say that it's 232 pages. Have you seen not only in episode 1, and as you will see again in episode 2, as well as at the end of this episode, this is simply not the case. The book is not 232 pages long. It is closer to around 90 pages long, including the postlude. You will see the entire copies of it on this channel. And for anybody claiming that they have a 232 page copy, just to reiterate and reinforce what Gary said, we encourage you to share that with the community because it is important. Also, to add to Gary's commentary, within the WorldCat archives, all 4 pages of these various libraries claiming to have it, most of which say that they are out of stock, non-existent, 404 page errors. If you actually go through the clicking and go through the links, you will see that nowhere in any of the world catalog of interlending libraries does it say it's anywhere near 232. It will say between 57, it will say 91. In some cases it says 47. So no, in our opinion, there is no 232 page book out there. Also, we checked into rare book finders. You can see a search for Chan Thomas reveals Adam and Eve story, and another one including the Adam and Eve story, including the postlude. Further investigation revealed a few eBay markers. When you open those up, you will see, yes, there are a few people selling the book. So we have a copy, and in theory, we could sell it. We're not going to do that, but we could have for $2,000. So we're not going to spend that amount of money. But looking at this image, this is not a 232 page book, right? Look here. In fact, this looks to me, Gary, and please comment if you disagree, this looks like it doesn't even include the postlude.
I don't see any indication that it does. That looks like the front and back cover of the first book.
Yes, thank you. I would agree. It's much shorter than 232. There is a second available on eBay for $2,500, which frankly does look like it includes the postlude. So if you're willing to fork up $2,500 for this, feel free to do it, or just hold on a couple minutes and we will introduce you into the postlude within the next couple seconds. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for your viewing pleasure, we're going to introduce you to the first few pages of the postlude to the Adam and Eve story. For the powers that be, please understand that this is for educational purposes, designed to promote discussion, and is clearly within the confines of U.S. copyright law as fair use. What you're looking at here is the chapter list, more or less, of the postlude to the Adam and Eve story. The entire team is here with their own insights and analysis, and we're going to begin discussing what Chan Thomas's theory is of the frozen woolly mammoths. Keep in mind that this is Chan Thomas's theory, and later on in the series, we'll have some further analysis and discussion about supplemental information and some further insight and our ideas related to Chan Thomas's work. But for now, this is what Chan Thomas has to say about the frozen woolly mammoths. He discusses how woolly mammoths are not really found in ice, that they're actually found in frozen mud.
Well, it's interesting on a couple of levels, one of which being that being encased in a depth, actually, of frozen mud, the Berescova River, is indicative of basically a mud pulse, a water pulse, something of a great, horrible, catastrophic event. That water rushed across the ground, the soil, the earth, picking up dirt, mud, rocks, trees, debris, pushing it along until it finally found the mammoth or mammoths and essentially instantaneously encased them in the mud.
And I'm looking here at this section. It says, mammoths were found that the skull was pink from hemorrhaging, denoting a death through suffocation by drowning in the mud. And Tony, you brought up something about how quickly this freezing event must have happened in order to preserve these creatures.
It stated it was done in 2 hours, so that means a super flash frozen type of event that, wouldn't be slow or over time. So something to consider of how that could actually happen.
What I found interesting was that Chan Thomas discussed how the problem with freezing slowly, so if this was a mini ice age or a true ice age event where temperatures gradually declined and then reached some sort of threshold where the woolly mammoths were then frozen and killed by the extreme temperature, when they found the woolly mammoths, they didn't contain the large crystals that occur when creatures slowly freeze. So it had to have been a very rapid event, and he says about 2 hours. And they know this because it didn't become this sort of mushy, non-fibrous meat of the animal. It was well preserved, which means it was this flash freezing event, almost like when the crustal displacement happens. As the crust sort of finishes its momentum and movement, the atmosphere and the water are still being propelled nearly 1,000 miles an hour. Gary, you were saying might account for almost a wind chill factor, right?
Well, that's what comes to mind, and that's what I think he alluded to in his writing, that you're looking at a high-speed wind chill that would instantly drop the temperature. I mean, you can imagine, especially if you have a lot of moisture in the air, and you have a high-speed wind chill hitting, I don't know, there are charts to figure out the wind chill. Let's say the ambient air temperature is 50 degrees, and all of a sudden you have, let's say, a 600-mile-an-hour wind chill. What would that be? And I suspect it'd be quite cold.
Yeah, and he talks about how there was an institute that attempted to do this to a steer, and that it was very difficult to do with a creature of that size. And imagine trying to do that for a woolly mammoth, which is much, much larger, weighing about 5 tons. The temperature involved must have been extreme, near negative 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I believe he says at least negative 80 degrees Fahrenheit here. That is an intense cold for 2 hours, and then the mammoths themselves are then drowned in the mud event that occurs, which is the crust displacing itself, and this wall of water and debris and landmass and air and atmosphere comes crashing in, and you find that they appear to have been sucked up into this with a drowning event and then flash frozen within 2 hours. And as he puts it, the whole process bespeaks of an inhuman supernatural violence. And he talks about how many of these animals were fractured, contained damage to their bodies, buried in muck alive, suffocated, and then quickly frozen in an utterly impossible sequence of events. Chan Thomas's first introduction into the Postlude is this idea about the frozen woolly mammoths and the bizarre events that must have happened to have flash frozen these creatures, and the incredible amount of mud and muck that was traveling at rapid speed to knock these creatures down, fracture their bones, and then drown them. So he starts with this pillar of evidence with his crustal displacement theory.
In the standard model, they typically say is 40,000 years ago was when a lot of the mammoths were found that were frozen. And I believe he's speaking of something much more recent in our timeline.
Thank you. That is true. He's talking about around 12,000 years ago from the present date. I'm glad you pointed it out that there are older mammoths. Perhaps they were killed in other types of extinction level events, or perhaps it is the cycle of this crustal displacement happening at the same time. So it's a very good piece of evidence. And that also brings up a point of what we're kind of calling the multi-event theory, where that there might be many cycles of many different types of events happening all in conjunction with one another. And we'll be investigating those throughout the rest of the series, beginning with Chan Thomas's crustal displacement.
Each cataclysm is like a giant hand sweeping across the countryside, leaving its fingerprints for us to find as we sift through the evidence in our search for the solution to this consuming mystery. These fingerprints sometimes are well hidden amongst the heavy footprints of uniformitarian evidence. The two disciplines, uniformitarian geology and cataclysmology, find no real contest between them. They complement each other, and actually, a marriage of the two schools is in order. The story of frozen mammoths is intriguing indeed. No frozen mammoth was ever found in ice. All have been found in frozen mud. Perhaps the most noted of the thousands found thusly is the Beresova mammoth, found near the Beresova River in northern Siberia. Like all mammoths found wherein some comment was made concerning the skull, it was noted that its skull was pink from hemorrhaging in the head, denoting death through suffocation by drowning in the mud. The Beresova mammoth was found about 1900, and more scientific data was gathered and recorded about this animal than any other such frozen behemoth. It appears that this beast also has initiated more scientific controversy than any other such find. To my way of thinking, one man's work stands far above the others. Ivan T. Sanderson, the biologist. He approached the problem from a frozen foods viewpoint, and was the first to do so. This is his story. When you freeze meat, the problem is to freeze it fast enough so the moisture contained in the meat does not have time to form into large crystals while freezing. The faster the freeze, the smaller the crystals. If you freeze meat too slowly, the moisture will form crystals large enough to destroy the fibrous structure of the meat. When defrosted, the meat will be nothing more than a mass of goo, unfit to cook or eat. The larger the piece of meat to be frozen, the more difficult it is to freeze it fast enough to avoid formation of the destructive moisture crystals, for heat must be removed at the same rate from, say, half a steer as from half a pound of ground meat. It would be the same problem if you had to freeze a bucket of water in the same time it takes to freeze a thimbleful. Now, a mammoth weighs up to 5 tons. The Siberian mammoth was smaller, but still a several-ton animal. When the Beresova mammoth was dissected by Russian scientists in 1901, they recorded that even the innermost lining of the beast's stomach had a perfectly preserved fibrous structure, indicating that body heat had been removed from the mammoth by some super-prodigious process in nature. Sanderson, taking special notice of this one point, took the problem to the American Frozen Foods Institute. What does it take to freeze an entire mammoth so that moisture crystallization does not have time to form in the inner lining of its stomach? The Institute really attacked this problem. To freeze a quarter or half a steer presented a big enough problem, but a whole mammoth? Some weeks later, the Institute went back to Sanderson with the answer. It's utterly impossible. With all of our scientific and engineering knowledge, there is absolutely no known way to remove the body heat from a carcass as big as a mammoth fast enough to freeze it without moisture crystals forming in the meat. Furthermore, after exhausting the scientific and engineering techniques, they looked to nature and concluded there was no known process in nature which could accomplish the feat. So many have loosely claimed that the Berescova mammoth, quote, fell in the crevasse, end quote, or, quote, fell in the ice, end quote, or some such nonsense. There is absolutely, positively, irrevocably no explanation in known processes of nature to explain the quick freezing of the Berescova mammoth and the muck in which he was suffocated and drowned. The Institute did tell Sanderson what it takes to do the job, however. First of all, the body temperature of the mammoth must be lowered about 140 degrees from its normal temperature, and it must be accomplished in an absolute outside time limit of approximately 4 hours. Actually, they concluded, the freezing process would have to take place in an elapsed time closer to 2 hours. In order to accomplish this impossible feat, be it in 2 or 4 hours, an infinite supply of cold would be necessary. And not just ordinary ice-cold cold, but closer to 80 degrees below zero cold. Moreover, after the mammoth was drowned in muck and quick frozen in and with it, he had to be kept at that sub-zero freezing temperature for thousands of years to be preserved as he was when discovered in 1900. The whole process bespeaks of an inhuman, supernatural violence. One foreleg, some ribs, and its pelvis were fractured. It was buried in muck alive, suffocated and drowned in the muck, and quick frozen in an utterly impossible sequence of events. But nonetheless, the process was performed, then kept frozen for thousands of years.
Now that we've just listened to and seen the first chapter of the Postlude to the Adam and Eve story entitled Frozen Mammoths, and you've heard the SuspectSky team's analysis of this chapter, I'd like to invite you all to visit the SuspectSky.com website, which is, frankly, in its infancy right now. But because we do not trust those we don't speak of to release the complete video, PDF, and audiobook on this platform, these will be available at SuspectSky.com. So look forward to more investigation into the rest of the postlude of the Adam and Eve story, including visual representation and visual coverage of the book, the team's analysis about its importance, and the expose which dramatically depicts the end of the world, as well as a deep investigation into who this individual was and the ties he had to the conspiratorial world. The rabbit hole is far deeper than you've ever imagined, and we'd like to take this journey with all of you together. This is the SuspectSky team signing off.